Writing ability becomes another extraneous factor, and not in the way that one would normally think. This is from the Pennsylvania Keystone exams, but this type of constructed response assessment is now being used in math assessments in both the Common Core consortiums and in state assessments that are implementing Common Core. And the way that it works, you see here, there's a general description of scoring guidelines. The student can get anywhere from 4 points to 0 points. The definitions are a little vague, and we'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. But the child is asked not just to complete the mathematical problem, but to write an explanation. And in this description of scoring guidelines, the document goes on to actually give an example. And so the example is a problem that has multiple parts. Part A, the child did correctly and got 1 point. Part B, the child did correctly and got 1 point. Part A and Part B were mathematical tasks that the child had to accomplish. Part C was a graph, a mathematical task. The child did it correctly and got 1 point. Part D was the child was asked to explain why all of those things worked. The child gave an explanation, but the example says the explanation was not sufficiently complex enough to justify the fact that the child did all the math correctly, so they lost a point. So they got 3 of the 4 possible points. If I were translating that into percentages, that would be a 75%. But they didn't lose a point because they couldn't do the math. They lost the point because they couldn't write about it. So this is not a math score. This is a writing score. The child did all the math correctly in the example, but was given a lower score because of their writing ability. That's an extraneous factor. Remember, construct validity. It tests exactly what it says it's going to test and nothing else. And no extraneous factors are supposed to interfere with how we measure the thing we say we're going to measure. Well, we said we were going to measure the child's ability to do mathematics, but we are measuring their ability to write. Does that matter? Yes. It will affect some populations more than others. The first affected population will be boys, because if you ask a little girl generally to write an essay, little girls will write a nice long essay. They'll put little hearts over the eyes. They may tell you what they had for breakfast that morning while they were preparing for the test. If you ask a little boy who has just finished a math problem to explain why he did the math the way he did it, a little boy will say, well, because that's the way it worked, because the math made sense to him. So on average, boys will get lesser scores, not because they couldn't do the math, but because they couldn't write about it. Who else does it affect? It affects ESL students, students for whom English is a second language, who may in fact have understood all the math that was being presented to them and have mastered it, but weren't yet able to explain themselves in standard English. It affects students with learning disabilities. Students with learning disabilities often have more trouble communicating in standard English than their non-disabled counterparts, even though they may have been able to do the math correctly, because their disability may be a language disability, not a mathematics disability. Unfortunately, in this system, they will get a lower math score, not a lower writing score. And it affects children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, for whom communicating in standard English is often a harder task. But those children, too, may have done the math correctly. They got a lower score in a test that said math, even though they did the math. Well, what's the effect of that? Why should we care? Because if they get a lower score, they're not going to be labeled proficient in math. So when those test results come back, because they didn't write well about it, they're going to get a lower math score and may not meet the state set bar for proficient. And if they're not proficient, they'll need to be remediated. Remediation requires time. If we have to be remediated, that means we need to take time out of the school day to remediate this child in math because they got a lower math score. According to the Coastal Courier, this was in the southern part of the country, this district said students will get remedial instruction for 3 hours a day. Out of their school day, we're going to take 3 hours to remediate them in math and or reading, depending on their scores in each of these assessments. When New York City schools dropped in 2010, some schools added 2.5-hour test prep sessions every day. So 2.5 hours out of the school day for those children went to remediation. When the Common Core tests were given in the state of New York principals actually wrote a letter about it, and the letter was written about and then quoted in the Washington Post. What did they say? They said that they had questions about the validity of the tests, and one of the reasons was that students who were labeled as failures in these tests were being forced out of classes. The principal said, we know many students who have never needed academic intervention before, they're now being mandated to go into remedial classes because they're getting failing scores in these Common Core math tests. Therefore, they have to give up other classes, maybe music or computer or other special classes, in order to fit remediation into their schedules. Now, if the child actually needed remediation in math, that would be one thing. But since we know that there are extraneous factors, and since we know that we are giving them a math score based on their writing ability, but putting them in math remediation, a problem is beginning to surface. It's important to remember what remediation is. Remediation means we're going to go back and repeat prior material. You didn't pass, so we're going to go back and do it over again. We're not moving forward. We're going to go back and do it again. So a student in math remediation is going to move more slowly in math because they can't move forward. They didn't pass the test, so we have to go back and do it again. Is that a good idea?